Okay, now I'm unmuted, so y'all can hear me online. That is good. I'm going to keep this running so that... I know. I'm talking to the people online, of which there are two. But there we go. This will hopefully be a lot better than before. Okay. Good evening, everybody. I'm very glad to see you all tonight on our first full day, and if this is your second night, I'm really thankful that you were crazy enough to come back to whatever this is. No, we've been here for how long, Alan?
14. This is our 14th.
This is our 14th year as an organization, and it is really great to see you all here as part of our 14th year, and there's way more than 14 people here, so that's great too. A couple of announcements that are coming up these next couple of weeks. This Saturday, first of all, is our debate night, debate-ish night. It's more of tonight a discussion watching night between an atheist and a recent convert to Christianity, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who grew up Muslim and then emigrated to the Netherlands, came in agnostic and realized the contributions that Christianity made to Western civilization and ended up being baptized herself. She's going to be discussing, or we're watching a pre-recorded discussion between her and Richard Dawkins, the famed atheist of the God delusion fame. And we'll see how it goes, and we'll be discussing it as well, and there will be pizza. I think if all goes according to plan, this will be in our regular room, SSA 12.471. I reserved it, and if they will let us watch the video in there and everything, then we'll do that. The Thursday after will be our big event of the semester. Oh, yeah?
What was the time on the Saturday night?
7.
Okay.
Yeah. Most things that we do are at 7 unless they're otherwise noted. By the way, reasonablefaithutd.org/announcements, I think, or whatever. There's an events page that has a table of our upcoming events, so if you ever want to check, you can go there. Next week, next Thursday night at 7. Next Tuesday, we will not be meeting. This will be a break from our regular schedule because on Thursday, we have Dr. Frank Turek of Cross-Examined fame-ish. Coming in, and he will be joining us to talk about why he doesn't have enough faith to be an atheist. That is going to be a really great talk with time for questions and all of that. It will hope to have y'all all there. Then the Saturday after that, which is September the 7th, we have our first Pancakes and Pontification of the year. This is when we used to go to a Denny's and then talk about any matter of apologetics or spirituality anybody wants to talk about. We're now going to do it at Rob's apartment that he has volunteered to us because Denny's has got really expensive for some reason. And we're just going to make some pancakes and we're going to hang out and bring your hard questions to that. We'll have more information about all of that forthcoming. I'm really sorry that I am the only person that you're going to hear tonight from up here, but hopefully this will be the last time that will happen. Usually we will have off-campus guests giving us lectures about apologetics and everything, but this time it's just me. I'm going to be sort of introducing our topics for, well, not topics, but our philosophy of the club and stuff in a way that I'm going to be continuing from the past year, answering this question. Are the Gospels intended as biographies? Yeah?
So, obviously, as the host of Pancakes and Pontification, I definitely 100% remember what day it's on, just to confirm it is Saturday the 7th. Right?
Yes. It's not this Saturday, the Saturday after it. And that one we do want to have in an apartment because we're going to have a bunch of griddles and stuff and probably short a breaker and everything, as always happens. So anyway, I don't know how long this will be. It could be way too long or way too short, and it also could be really bad. So hope for your grace, as this is the first and only time this semester that I'll be doing this, but hopefully it will turn out well. Last week, as I was introducing the club's philosophy, by the way, this is Papyrus P52. This is the earliest document that we have of any of the accounts of Jesus' life, of the Gospels. This is from John, and this is from about either the late 1st century or the early 2nd century. So this is a very good artifact to begin our discussion today. Last week, I talked about the surprising rebirth of belief in God. Justin Brierley, who moderated debates between Christian and atheists for 18 years or so, is observing an increase in attendance or care for spiritual matters in Western civilization right now. And I realize I didn't mention where this is coming from, but this is what it is. It's a podcast that you can listen to. It's a very good podcast. I recommend you think about it. One of the people that he mentioned in this was Jordan Peterson, this snaz fest of a suit that he's got here, who recently filled up a whole university auditorium with a seminar on the Gospels, talking in a panel discussion about how the accounts of Jesus' life contain really useful teachings that we can apply to our lives and make better lives out of them because of that. But as I was listening to a little bit of what he was talking about, as he was sort of analyzing what the accounts of Jesus' life contained, what Jesus said in them, and what it might mean for us, he was reading them still as myths. He was reading them as stories that are didactic. They have the power to teach us things, but they have the power to teach us things in a similar sense to the way that Daedalus and Icarus has the power to teach us things. It's a myth that is obviously fictional, but it wants to teach us to, not fly too close to the sun and all of that, and I guess don't make waxen wings and stuff like that. So instructive, maybe based off of a real figure, but overall not necessarily true, and maybe the more fantastical, as we might call it, accounts. Well, what do we do with this? Well, we would probably want to go to the origins a little bit more and ask the question, how do the faiths themselves, the major religions that are in the marketplace of ideas that I had mentioned last week, think about their central claims, and also what claims do they make? So I scoured my own knowledge and the internet. How much was my knowledge and how much is the internet is irrelevant. But for some basic creeds, some basic expressions of belief of the 5+1 major religions. And so I came up with this. Hinduism really has sorry, I was looking at the next slide. There's not too much. I don't want to impose any sort of Western way of thinking on an Eastern religion too much, but the Hindu religion doesn't have a formally organized set of beliefs. It's generally, there are some unifying characteristics to it, but people will express what the Hindu faith means to them in myriad different ways. It's really much more of a cultural movement at the moment. Buddhism, this is one of the sects of Buddhism, one of the things that they would express. I rely on Amida Buddha with all my heart for the attainment of nirvana. This is interesting because if you remember from last week, I mentioned claims can be about in an ice cream kind of claim or an insulin kind of claim. If I say that I like mint chocolate chip ice cream, that's a claim that's more about me. It's more subjective to my own experiences, my own perspective, whereas if I make the claim that ice cream is an effective cure for diabetes, I'm making an objective claim and one that can be true or false for everybody, and that claim in particular is false. We notice here that this claim is more of is expressing spirituality in more of an ice cream kind of way. This is more what I rely on, and it's not necessarily an expectation that anybody else rely on it. Baha'i is sort of a modern religion. One of the things that Baha'u'llah, the founder of this religion, says is the earth is, what? Please, thank you for correcting me, because I did not want to mispronounce that, but I did. The earth is but one country and mankind its citizens. This isn't the only sort of expression of belief that he gave us, but the first thing that we remark from this is that it's written in figurative language, and a creed that is expressed in figurative language as an objective truth. Philosophers of a religion would refer to this as not all that useful. Now, here's my theology tangent for the night. There's an idea that was suggested by George Lindbeck at Yale Divinity School, who was actually my bishop's advisor for his PhD thesis. He says that religions should be thought of in more of a cultural linguistic way. They're like languages that aim to strengthen a community's interactions with other members of the community. So just as learning a language requires cultural immersion, it's necessary also to spend time in a community to fully understand what the community means when it makes the claims that bind it together. I think this is largely true. However, when we get into the Abrahamic religion, sort of on this other side of this divide, as we're about to, we encounter some statements of belief that are presented with semantic clarity. You don't need to first spend time in this community to understand what those claims mean, particularly because agreement with the claim is really the way into your community in the first place. So for example, we have Judaism that says, this phrase is called the Shema, which means hear. It says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." This is a statement that says the Lord is unitary. There are not multiple gods. This is the God that should be worshipped by all people, or it's more of an Old Testament monotheism, but it is a claim to uniqueness of the existence of one God. However, there's not really anything outside of this claim that could be questioned or put under the magnifying glass, as it were. This is the Shahada. I also said that wrong, so you want to? Shahada, yes. Which is all that you have to say in order to become a Muslim. If you were to say this say this with your heart behind it, which is one of the reasons why I'm not going to actually quote it. So there's an underlying historical claim in this that says Muhammad actually did become the messenger of God at one point. This is objective, he either did or he didn't, but it's also sort of an intentionally unverifiable thing. I would say it's intentionally unverifiable as a Christian. I understand that there's more than enough room for discussion on that, but it is difficult to verify whether or not Muhammad actually received messages from God and stuff. But we get towards Christianity, which you know that we were going to get to, and we end up with one of the earliest expressions of faith that could even be within 3 years or so after Jesus' alleged resurrection. This is St. Paul talking to the church in Corinth, saying that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures. That means in accordance with what the Scriptures predicted about it. That he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. This is the one that, of course, we're going to be investigating today. This is one that is semantically clear. It doesn't appear to be intended to be a symbolic truth. It's also historically grounded. And it has at least eyewitnesses that claimed to be eyewitnesses who allegedly recorded their observations of Jesus' life and the subsequent events in the 4 accounts that we call the Gospels. Which are attributed traditionally to Matthew, a tax collector and a follower of Jesus, Mark, a follower of Peter, who was known as the head disciple of Jesus, Luke, a physician, a researcher, and also a follower of Paul, who says that Jesus miraculously appeared to him and changed his life and wrote that creed that we previously saw. And finally, John, a follower of Jesus who tradition tells us was the only one not to be killed for his beliefs. So tonight we're going to ask this question of, are these things that these 4 men allegedly wrote written as myths, or are they written as biographies that were intended to be accurate? Myths that were intended to be fantastical and didactic, but not necessarily historically accurate, or biographies that intended to be right in an insuline kind of sense. The answer to this question will have profound implications, obviously, for how we think about the Christian faith, and it will bring us into what C.S. Lewis what scholars of C.S. Lewis now call the trilemma. He says that Jesus can either be a fool, somebody who lied, or a lunatic, so he was either insane or about his own identity because he claimed to be God, or he could be lying about that claim, or he could actually be correct in this view. If we don't accept that these are written as biographies, we have a way out, and we can say that these accounts were overblown and they were divine attributes were added to them and stuff. So you could say Jesus was a great moral teacher, but you don't have to accept his claim to be God. But if this is actually true, what's going on in here, or these are actually written as biographies or accounts of a life, then we're brought into this discussion where Jesus is either a liar, a lunatic, or the Lord. So my thesis tonight is simple. These accounts were primarily written as factual biographies of a historical figure. Now the last pretext, or the last preface that I want to include, is brought to us by Carl Sagan, one of the famed atheists of the mid and late 20th centuries. He died in the 90s. He says, "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." This is sort of his heuristic thing that says, if you're going to claim something outlandish like the resurrection, you should have really overbearing, very weighty evidence in favor of this proposition. Now, this actually, when you think about it epistemologically in a theory of knowledge sort of sense, is not actually true. Extraordinary claims require just as much evidence as any other claim, provided that said evidence supports the most adequate explanation for the data that you have in front of you. But still, it kind of works as a heuristic. Excuse me. But if I'm going to grant Dr. Sagan this claim, then I'm going to take the converse for myself, and I'm going to say that modest claims require modest evidence. And so tonight I'm just going to make a relatively modest claim. I'm not saying that everything recorded in the gospel accounts is factually correct and must be believed. I'm not saying that Jesus rose from the dead tonight. These are things that you can contend for in an apologetic argument, but it's not the apologetic argument I'm making tonight. It's really early in the year. I'm going to make the claim just simply that these accounts are written primarily as factual biographies of a historical figure who actually existed, and you can take that or you can leave it. But then I think that this burden of proof for myself should be a little bit lower if you're going to accept Carl Sagan's heuristic, which I really don't, for what I'm saying today, because this should be something that, regardless of whether you follow Christ or whether you're considering or whether you reject him entirely, at least something that we should all accept as plausible. And I think that the evidence for this is more than modest. I think it's quite comfortable and can lead us quite comfortably to uphold this claim. Yeah, Ashton?
I was thinking that phrase, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, means balancing personal incredulity. I may be less likely to believe that someone 2,000 years ago rose from the dead than I would be to believe that aliens visited us, but it doesn't say anything about whether one claim is more extraordinary than the other.
Yeah, I agree with that because, like I was saying, we really should evaluate claims based off of explanatory power and not on their outlandishness. And if we have the best explanation for the facts is aliens, then we should think about it a little bit more. I don't think the best explanation for the facts is aliens, though. Yeah, Shrey?
I feel like this is also kind of maybe an ice cream statement where like
Hmm.
when you say extraordinary claim, that is with regards to yourself because you're yourself.
Yeah, that you regard as extraordinary?
Yeah. Like
Yeah,
you
yeah.
are extraordinary, but in a way that also makes sense because the more extraordinary a claim is, that means that there's like it shifts more of your map of reality, it shifts more of your beliefs, more like the more of your beliefs are resting on that claim. So when you shift it, more stuff collapses, and in order to justify to yourself that okay, like, I need to consider all these beliefs that are built on top of that. Each person would require probably some like monumentous like evidence or some monumentous
Yeah.
Marxism.
So it's like saying that like foundational claims to your identity require foundational evidence?
If like if I made a it's kind of like you as a Christian, you probably require a lot of like sustained evidence over time in order to like change your view of Christianity. Like if you were to encounter evidence against it somehow in terms of like how you act,
Yeah.
how the world responds, or like historical or whatever, you would probably continue. We'd probably think okay, there's a discrepancy here. But,
Yeah.
Like it takes more and more evidence to prove that.
Sure. I mean, for me, I'd like to say that if somebody were to just roll up the body of Jesus here, so show his bones in some way could identify them as Jesus' dead body here, I would abandon my faith immediately. But I understand, like, there are some things that are embedded into the fabric of who I am that are difficult to change.
That might be an evidence for you because that might be like, or I think we're saying the same thing.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I rely on this really basic fact of reality that I believe that Jesus actually rose from the dead in a literal historical event. And if that's disproven for me, then my worldview would fall. And I understand that, and I want to be intellectually honest in that. But at the same time, that would require Jesus' body there, or something like that, to be the best explanation for the reality in front of it. Yeah. Did you have something to say, Brian?
Yeah, I was just going to say on that point, I think at the very least what we can say is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence is ambiguous in
Yeah.
what's meant by extraordinary. So like
It
one
is.
definition you gave just now in your description was requiring the adjustment of lots of beliefs that you already hold. And that's a legitimate principle. If adopting some new piece of information would require me to recant 10 beliefs that I already hold with adequate evidence, then I should demand more evidence for
Yeah.
that, right? If it contradicts all my held beliefs. So I think that's maybe the modest form of what we can say is that for some definitions of extraordinary, that's right, and for other definitions, it's ambiguous or even wrong.
Yeah, sure.
It's just, it's dangerous when people throw it out like a given,
Uh-huh.
and they might mean anything by the word extraordinary,
Yeah.
such as I find this to be shocking or unbelievable,
Yeah.
which is not,
Yep.
a very helpful.
Makes sense. Yeah, extraordinary in an ice cream way, maybe, or my standard of extraordinariness. I would say, resurrection, more extraordinary claim than these are written as biographies, and that's at least the standard that I'm taking it on for this discussion. But anyway, we got into a big tangent on that, so shall we begin? First of all, I want to note that the gospel accounts sound like written history. This seems kind of obvious. A little bit. You would want written history to sound that way a little bit. But when we compare things, here's one example of the beginning of a particular story. Long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. This will be a little bit familiar to you. This is from Star Wars. Now, is this fact or fiction? Fiction. It's pretty obvious. There's no... Okay, I'm sorry. I should leave. I realize I'm in a room of nerds. No, I include myself in that, but really not for the sequels. No, but we really have no information within this that would suggest to us that there's fact here. It's very ambiguous. It's far, far away. We don't know what galaxy, those things like that. It's fiction. What about, this is from, well, I'm not going to tell you where it's from. Sing, O goddess, the anger of Achilles, son of Peleus, that brought countless ills upon the Achaeans. Many a brave soul did it and send hurrying down to Hades, and many a hero did it yield a prey to dogs and vultures, so that the day on which the son of Atreus, king of men, and great Achilles first fell out with one another. Fact or fiction? Iliad, exactly. Homer, Iliad, Book 1. This is the beginning of a work of fiction. It is written with extreme literary devices and with not too much identifying information itself either. Here's one. I'm sorry for the block of text here, but we have here, we're going to talk about what followed a certain event, and he says, we have nothing so much at heart as this, that we may admit no facts, either through ignorance or laziness, blah, 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 blah. It's hard to understand these facts because of their distance from our times, but we aim to do it with the proper beauty of style, blah, blah, blah. The principal scope that authors ought to aim at, above all the rest, is to speak accurately, and to speak truly for the satisfaction of those that are otherwise unacquainted with such transactions, and obliged to believe what these writers inform them of. Fact or fiction? This is, huh? Yeah, what?
Is this how to write history?
It is not. This is Josephus in his Antiquities of the Jews, book 14. He's getting into sort of, if I remember correctly, this is about 400 BC that he's recording. So this is what he clearly intends to be fact, even if he might have had several inaccuracies in his recording of fact. How about this one? Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us. It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely from some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. Is it written as fact or fiction? It is written as fact. This is the introduction to the Gospel of Luke, Luke 1, 1 through 3. I didn't include that. We have another example of this. You see the difference between this and Iliad. We have particular claims of objectivity, particular claims that the result of this writing should be certainty. Yes, sir?
Didn't you say you would cherry pick certain verses? Because like there's some verses that like the word was, in the beginning there was word, the word was God.
Yeah, so that's right. I'm going to be talking, so that's the Gospel of John, the introduction to the Gospel of John, which many people would say is primarily a work of theology rather than a work of history. But when you look internal to the text of Luke's Gospel, you see a lot of evidence that it's written primarily as history. And we're going to encounter some evidence later in this discussion that will give us good reason to believe the Gospel of John is written as history, but with a little bit more explanation of sort of the theological effects of that history. Does that make sense? Yeah. Another example of this is Luke chapter 3, 1. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, and Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, etc. We have here an exact year, an exact ruler, an exact governors of particular areas, and exact locations. This is the way that history is written, especially ancient history, which lacked the luxury of quick date references that we have right now. This is the way that essentially we would say at the beginning of an account of the pandemic in March 2020, this locates it just as well as to say in the UN Secretariat General of Antonio Guterres and the presidency of Donald Trump and the governorship of Greg Abbott and the mayorship of Plano of Harry Lahosselière and that kind of thing. So we have precision here. We have exactness. And this is what we would expect of a historical account, and it's what we have in the Gospels. In addition, the gospel sources claimed to be recounting history. They said they were written history. This is also sort of a modest thing, but it has weight. First, Peter is traditionally understood to be the informer for the gospel according to Mark. And he says that, "For we did not follow cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty." Eyewitnesses. He's not saying something that he just made up. 1 John, this is the person or community that wrote the gospel according to John, and in one of his letters he says, "That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our own eyes, which we have looked upon and have touched with our hands, concerning the word of life, that which we have seen and heard, we proclaim also to you." Now, just like you said, John is more of a theologian, he's less of a historian, but it's clear that his theology that he's expressing is informed by history, not a theology that intends to fabricate history in order to support it. The gospel accounts also contain several details that match a historical genre and not a mythological one. I couldn't really express that more concisely, but I hope that it makes as much sense as the previous 2 points. To put it concisely, I guess, though, they don't seem to be keeping any secrets from their readership. I have a few points from Frank Turek, whom we are going to be hearing from just next week, who wrote this little book, "I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist," about why he doesn't have enough faith to be an atheist. And he includes a few pieces of evidence that internally to the Gospels, without looking at anything outside of them yet, we see historical genre, historical literary style, rather than mythological and trumped up kind of ways of writing. So number one, oh, by the way, this is where we're going to be next week, and you should all be there in the SSA Auditorium. We see he has this criterion of, you want it? Here you go. We have this criterion of embarrassment, where people intending to fabricate a historical narrative and make it up have every opportunity and every temptation as well to make themselves look good. However, this is not what we see in the accounts of Jesus' life. We see a lot of the writers, or the people who informed the writers, being very embarrassed and looking like the comic reliefs of the whole shebang. We have the apostles being dim-witted. They often fail to understand what Jesus is saying. They're often irresponsible. They fall asleep on Jesus twice as he's about to die and as he's literally sweating blood, about to die and everything, and yet they fall asleep on him. They seem not to care in that instance. They're rebuked. Peter, who most plurality of Christians say is the first pope, first bishop of Rome and all of that, and sort of the head of the church, was called Satan, and he's corrected publicly by another writer and didn't make any attempt to hide that fact. He also denied knowing Jesus 3 times, which fits into cowardliness. All of the disciples flee after Jesus' arrest. We know this very clear. Nobody really denies that. Peter denies knowing him, after promising, "I will never disown you." And also, after the resurrection, or the alleged resurrection at least, the 12 of them were hiding in a locked room, so they wouldn't even go out and look at Jesus' body. The women were the first, actually, to discover that Jesus' tomb was empty. This is actually a very dishonorable thing for such a context, because women's testimony, unfortunately, wouldn't have even been considered in court. So this is kind of a disappointing way to start a religion if you want to do it. It's kind of embarrassing. Even after this event, though, the disciples seemed to doubt, despite being taught several times that Jesus would rise from the dead. His disciples seem not to believe the news very, very often. The question, of course, is, would you include these details in a made-up story? Probably not. It almost seems as though Jesus couldn't have picked worse people to begin his life-changing message of love, and probably the movement that has had more effect on the direction of civilization in the world than anything else. The reason why it's the year 2024. It's kind of a disappointing start to that. But the simplest explanation, like we were saying, with the extraordinary claims and stuff, and the modest claims and all of that, is that the people who are writing these things intended to express things accurately, even if it made them look bad, and actually especially if it made them look bad. Because, one of the ideas of Christianity is Jesus must increase while we decrease, while we discount ourselves. But at the same time, the evangelists, the writers of these accounts, were honest about Jesus. They seem to make the guy who claimed to be king over everything, he makes him look like a total failure. His own family is recorded to have considered him as out of his mind. He was disbelieved by his own brothers and about who he was, who he claimed to be, and all of that. The difficult sayings that he taught were rejected by his followers to the point that they go from hanging on his every word to wanting to stone them, and he has to stone him, and he has to do sort of a vanishing act in order to avoid that rather inconvenient ending to the Gospels. He was called a drunkard, he was called a demoniac, he was called a madman, and he was crucified. This is the most shameful possible death, in my opinion, that the Roman Empire could inflict on anybody. And the Old Testament scriptures, the Jewish scriptures, tell us that anyone who hangs on a tree is cursed. So we have a cursed Messiah, a cursed anointed one, a cursed king. Bishop N.T. Wright, who's a great theologian in the Church of England and probably the last real theologian in the Church of England, to be perfectly honest, would say that sort of this miraculous transformation of this symbol of the cross, from a symbol of shame and torment to a symbol of power and victory, it wouldn't have taken place if Jesus' followers didn't think that they had at least a reason to think of a torture stake as a throne of victory for a king. And that's food for thought and something to talk about in a different talk. Now, they also were honest about Jesus' tough teachings. If they made up a myth, they certainly didn't invent a myth that made life easy for them. They fabricated a leader that taught them that lust is akin to adultery, sorry guys, we're all guilty, and cursing somebody out is akin to killing him. Mad as murder, veganism, or whatever. We should turn the other cheek when we face violence, sort of turning on its head the common declaration that silence is violence. We should respond to violence with silence. That we must be perfect, as God is perfect. And that also we must eat and drink Jesus to have eternal life. He says this in John 6. And of course, Christian theologians understand what this means. It's a lot less outlandish than it seems at first. But we did have to have apologists like Justin Martyr saying that Christians are not cannibals as a result of this teaching. And then also people, you're ready to die. He says it's recorded in at least 3 of the Gospels that if anybody wants to follow him, he must deny himself, take up his own cross, and then follow this guy who claimed to be God. Hello, my name is Jesus Christ. Do you want to follow me? Prepare to die. Anyway, I hope everybody gets all of the allusions that I'm making in this, because it's total nerdiness. People would not easily impose, however, these standards on themselves. It's pretty clear to say that, and so it's much a simpler explanation to say that they did not impose these standards upon themselves. They were imposed on them externally from Jesus Christ himself. This is an interesting one. The gospel writers made very clear when quotations of Jesus began and ended. This is a little, it doesn't make too much sense, but it's actually pretty weighty because the Greek language lacked quotation marks, so it was often very difficult to determine when a quote began and when it ended. Now, the reason that they would actually want to selectively quote is that it would have been easy to make Jesus say exactly what the authors wanted him to say. This is kind of, you combine misconstrued quotes of your Messiah, and then with the authority that he's given you as an apostle, as somebody who's sent out to proclaim his message, and you could have solved pretty much all of the disputes the early church was dealing with. But we see in the early church a lot of disagreement. And actually that's a mark of authenticity and a mark of sort of a lack of mind control at the beginning of this movement, that the writers of these accounts were at least intellectually honest in the way that they were quoting him. There is some ambiguity in some examples of Jesus' quotations. John 3 is an example of that. But in general, where Jesus begins to speak, where he finishes speaking, demonstrates a pretty high standard of accuracy of quotation, especially when you consider other texts like the Iliad and stuff that are a little bit ambiguous in several places. Finally, and I find this one interesting because of what we've already talked about with the Iliad, the writer's retelling of miraculous events is actually pretty boring. So let's observe how the resurrection of Jesus is painted in a few of the Gospels. This is the Gospel of Luke. I'll give you a second to take a look because I don't want to read that at the moment. There does not appear to be a heavy weight of figurative language here. I'll post these so you don't have to take a picture of them all, and all of that. So, that's to say we have a recollection of a future prophecy and everything, but that's the most religious sort of sense that we have this, within this text. Go on to the Gospel of Mark. We see a similar lack of extravagant or figurative language in this account. They're sent out, and they're just sort of surprised, and they end up sort of falling flat in their declaration of this gospel, at least according to the surface level reading of Mark right now. John, which is sort of this work of theology that we were thinking about, also includes a pretty mundane account. There continues not to be some really harrowing or miraculous things. The Gospel of Matthew, however, is, right, did I include this? No, I did include Matthew. Yes, and I colored this wrong. But anyway, Matthew is a little bit more sensational than the other accounts of Jesus' resurrection, but it's not much of a leap compared to other things that we have when you compare it with Gospels that were written significantly after the events took place and were written in very sensational language. An example of this is the pseudo-gospel of Peter, which was written in the late or early 3rd century at the earliest. We have a lot of really weird things that are going on in this passage here, and it's worth mentioning a few of them. We have sort of people coming on the Sabbath and stuff. The other Gospels do not, other Gospels implicitly deny this happening. There's a large crowd going over to see the tomb. Actually, it seemed like a bunch of people had abandoned Jesus after his death. And then they see the heavens opened. A bunch of people see this. 2 men descend shining with a great light. Stone rolls away by itself instead of being pushed over and stuff. And the soldiers are surprised, as it is in the Gospel of Matthew and all. And then finally, as people are coming out of the tomb, we have 2 of them sustaining another one and a cross following after them. The cross was not buried with Jesus, by the way. The 2 they saw had heads that reached up into heaven, but the head of him that was led by them went beyond heaven. It's hard to know what that means. And they heard a voice out of the heavens saying, "Hast thou preached unto them that sleep?" The answer that was heard from the cross was, yes. If you're a Christian, this kind of gives you tingles down your spine, but that's actually probably not great. This is really exciting. It's really incredible in the traditional sense of what that word means, which is not credible. Not only because I don't want to see a bunch of mega spirit giraffes going up into heaven, I also find all of these details overall difficult to get behind. Yeah.
So the other one with Matthew, and
Yeah.
he wrote about like the appearance and like the glory of the risen Jesus.
Mhm.
Is that perhaps because he was writing to a primarily Jewish audience, painting Jesus as the Messiah and King that was prophesied in the Old Testament,
Yeah.
whereas the others had different audiences?
That's exactly what I was thinking as you were asking that question, of like an explanation for that this fits well with the audience to which Matthew is writing, which is primarily a Jewish audience. Yeah, Byron.
Go back to the Mark passage.
Let's see, here we are.
Um,
This doesn't extend into the textually disputed part of it. Yeah.
No, I had a specific question.
Mhm.
Now, I'll raise my hand again if I remember it.
Okay, got it. I understand that. Yeah, Jaron.
Like figurative language in like other parts of the gospel, like I don't know, clanking your brother's eye or cut off your hand.
Yeah. Well, this is Jesus using figurative language, right? And it's not the disciples using figurative language to describe what Jesus did. All of the Gospels include Jesus himself using figurative language, but we don't have any reason to believe that those quotes were intended to be inaccurate. Yeah, so there's a difference between words that are quoted and words that are intended as accounts of what happened. But that's a very good question. So not only I don't want to see mega spirit giraffes, but there are things that are incredible, things that are extravagant in this text, things that indicate a divorce from the actual events that took place, and also things that contradict the accounts that were from far earlier, far closer to the actual events. This is where we come up with against one of the biggest objections to the writing of the Gospels as biographies rather than as myths, which are, or at least the general reliabilities of the Gospels, which is the apparent contradictions that are present in them. This is sort of trying to be from Robert Frost, two roads diverged in a yellow wood. But it was really bad and it did not work. So we see a lot of divergent accounts, or things that appear to be divergent, at least some potential disagreements in these accounts. We want to acknowledge them. The number of women at the tomb does not appear to be the same or unified on the first glance. The number of angels at the tomb, even whether there were angels, is also not unified. Let's see. what the women did after, or what the women did after this encounter is also not unified. Whom they first told, and then also what happened to the guards, if there were any Roman guards guarding the tomb. However, note that none of these apparent disagreements actually exclude each other. The women at the tomb could have been Mary, Mary, and Salome, or they could have been Mary, Mary, and I'm trying to remember the name of the other woman who appeared in one of the Gospels, and I cannot remember. Yes, Joanna, thank you. And by the way, if you're writing a myth, what you don't want to do is name all of your most important women the same name. But this is something that, this is something that the Gospel writers did. It seemed to be counterintuitive if you're writing a myth, and we're going to mention that a little bit later in the talk. Nonetheless, we admit that the narrative here is not necessarily unified, even if they don't exclude the possibility of the other ones taking place. Now, J. Warner Wallace is a very good apologist and probably the most influential person that I've had the privilege of standing in a urinal next to. I was at a conference. I was at a conference with him at one point, and I was like, "Oh, that is J. Warner Wallace." Anyway, this is a gentleman who grew up Mormon and abandoned his faith pretty quickly after adulthood, and he became a homicide detective like his father, and he decided one day that he was going to apply the standards of homicide investigation to the claims that are made in the accounts of Jesus' life and see how they pass muster. And as a result of that investigation, he became a Christian. What do you know? Now, one of the things that he mentions is that as a detective is investigating a homicide or a similar crime, and there are several witnesses, what he'll do is he'll try to separate the witnesses as quickly as possible because he doesn't want those witnesses to collude. If they end up sitting in the back of a police car together, they can end up talking about what they'd seen and say, "Oh yeah, I did see that," and whatever, and they can skew their testimonies. So the detectives will want to come up, separate the witnesses as quickly as possible. And we have here evidence of this witness separation because, you think of a homicide and one person tells you he was wearing a green T-shirt. The other one tells you he was wearing a teal T-shirt. This appears not to be the same thing. The one doesn't exclude the possibility of the other. Teal is also kind of green. We have ambiguities in words for this kind of thing. But the fact that these two witnesses have slightly different accounts of what actually happened, if they both say the same thing about the central thing, which was, he pulled out a gun using his, and people might say, left hand, one other person might say right hand, but he definitely pulled out his gun and he shot the person. That could simply mean these two people saw the event take place from different vantage points, influenced by their different life experiences, their different areas of expertise. One might be an artist and he might care a lot about the difference between things. One might be left-handed and he might care a lot about the difference between hands and all of that. But when the details, when the main idea is unified, the jury actually has significantly more reason to believe the general claim when the peripheral claims diverge a little bit, because that means that these witnesses have not colluded with each other, and it means that overall what they say can be treated as reliable. So here we go. We have a lot of agreement on the main storyline. We know definitely that this event allegedly took place on the third day after the crucifixion, that several women went to the tomb and found it empty. Women were also the first to tell this news to the disciples. A few disciples went and saw for themselves this happening. Then Jesus began, as Luke writes in his second volume, Acts, presented himself alive to them by many convincing proofs. This means that despite all of the things that might be disagreements but aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, we have credence toward the fact that internal to the texts, it is obvious that the writer's overall desire was to portray what happened accurately. But so far, we have only considered the internal evidence. When we zoom out, this is a really bad zoom animation, but there we go. When we zoom out and consider these writings in comparison with data outside the New Testament text, things only get better when we consider things in context, in this Middle Eastern context with so many disputed borders. unfortunately. Now recall that all I'm trying to defend today is the modest claim that the Gospels were intended as accurate biographies. So I'm not going to touch as much on evidence that the accounts actually are factually correct. I expect that Ryan Cruz in October, I think, is going to deal with that a lot more thoroughly than I will. So stick around for October. Of course, there's a lot of overlap between written is history and is history, but I'm going to try and humble myself and limit tonight to contending that the writers knew what they were talking about in a way that eyewitnesses would know and mythologists would not know. Excuse me again. Now, first of all, the Gospels demonstrated intimate familiarity with the time and places that they knew about. Wow, my PowerPoint is slow. They knew their stuff geographically, first of all. This is what New Testament scholar Peter J. Williams, who has his book, Can We Trust the Gospels, which is also a very nice and concise resource defending the overall claims, goes a lot beyond what I'm talking about today. He calls this the criterion of familiarity. Were the people who claimed to be biographers familiar with the things that they were biographing? It doesn't prove that everything that they wrote is true, but it does demonstrate that they knew enough about the events that they were describing to be at least able to write history and not forced to write myths, and they cared enough about accuracy to draw on that knowledge of the context that surrounded them. You know, if you asked me to write an account of Jesus' life and his death and his resurrection, mine would end up sounding a lot like a myth. Not because I don't want to write something that's true, not because I would fabricate some giraffe angels and whatever, but because I don't know, I know relatively little about the architecture of Jerusalem and the areas surrounding it. I know very little about its culture, its economics, its law, its language, its predominant religions, etc. At least compared to somebody who would have lived there for 20 years. It's like asking somebody who has lived in Houston to describe what Dallas is like or something. It's not going to be as good as somebody from Dallas, obviously. So we know, however, that the writers knew their geographical stuff. The gospel writers seem to know the towns and regions where the towns were. We have, in Peter J. Williams' book, a pretty good table describing the very wide variety of place names that are included in all four Gospels, not only the ones that are called synoptic, the ones that seem to be a little bit more historic than the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John passes with flying colors here as well, including fairly obscure towns. We have things like Bethsaida, Magadan, and Sychar, which would not be on the hugest, on a very top level map of this area. Actually, within this, we have a vindication of the Gospel of John as well, like I was saying, where if this is a work of theology, we would expect a little bit less reference towards these objective places. But we actually do have places within the Gospel of John that are mentioned only there and are found archaeologically to be correct. One example of that, as I'll mention really quickly, within this section on bodies of water and where they were. We have mentions of the River Jordan, which is kind of obvious, but smaller things like the River Kidron, the Pool of Siloam, the Pool of Bethesda, which is another vindication of the Gospel of John. We thought that this event where Jesus heals a blind man, a lame man, in the Pool of Bethesda was a fabrication until skeptics thought that, until the 19th century when this pool was discovered. Now, the Gospel of John claims that this pool has 5 roofed colonnades, and archaeologists only found 4. So skeptics were able to say, you know, there's only 4 colonnades here. This is an inaccuracy in the writing. Until 1964, where there was a central colonnade that was discovered. And so once again, we have a vindication of this gospel that is a lot less historical in its literary style, a lot more theological in its literary style, but more credence to the idea that this is an overall theology informed by history writing instead of just theology. Yes, Seth?
I just want to point out the fact that it was theorized before the actual colonnades were discovered, that like the 5 colonnades mentioned could be like some figurative speech metaphor for the 5 books of the Pentateuch. So,
Figurative
just kind of
colonnades.
going back to like
Yeah.
the figurative speech and metaphors
Yeah.
versus actual history. Like that's kind of what the skeptics wanted to make it out to be. But then it turned out, no, it's just there were just 5 colonnades. He was just accurately describing what was there.
That's a really good piece of information. I didn't know that. Thank you. Third, we have places that are now a bunch of tourist attractions by Christian tourists who want to see all of the cool spots. But they were not at that time. They were relatively obscure. We have places like Gabbatha, Golgotha, the Mount of Olives, the Sheep Gate of Jerusalem, Solomon's Portico, those things that people would know from the area, but people who are from Rome or from Egypt, where many of the early Christians lived, would not be familiar with. Peter J. Williams also assesses the frequency that the writers name places, and that's about 5 times per 1,000 words on an average of the 4 Gospels, and concludes that this is exactly within the range that you would expect if people are listing place names because they are relevant, not because they're not knowing any of the place names or because they're listing them to show off, like I know all of these places or anything like that. Finally, this is an interesting piece that the gospel writers seem to know topography pretty well, sort of the elevation sort of thing. Luke 10 has Jesus saying that a man went down to Jericho from Jerusalem. Luke here seems to know that Jerusalem is at a higher elevation than Jericho, which is correct, since Jericho is actually the lowest city on earth, about 280 yards below sea level.
Yeah, I mean, to add on that, one of my favorite points that Dr. McGrew brought up last semester
I'm mentioning him.
how skeptics like to pick apart Mark and how he doesn't know geography, and how Jesus takes this really long, circuitous route from Tyre to Galilee instead of just going in a straight line. And a lot of skeptics are saying, well, clearly Mark doesn't know what he's talking about because this route makes no sense, not knowing the fact that there's a mountain in the way.
Yeah.
Maybe not going through the mountain.
This is really good, where skeptics fail in the standard that the gospel writers pass in. That's a good piece. Luke and John both have Jesus going down to Capernaum from several locations, all of which indeed require a descent of over 300 yards. You have to live there to know this. These are hard to know if you're not from the area. Going up or down isn't exactly something you think about. Are we going up a hill when we go downtown to Dallas, or are we going down a hill? Most of us would probably think down, and it actually is at a lower elevation than Plano or places like that. But the writers seem to know this stuff by instinct. And that is, the standard of topographical knowledge is a far higher standard than we can attain to in the forged Gospels from much later. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, names Judea once and names nothing else. The Gospel of Philip names 3 locations, all of which are pretty much as commonly known as New York. So it's like, I went to New York, I went to Brooklyn, and I went to Manhattan, and then I went to the Bronx. That is not an exactly impressive thing to say. The Gospel of Judas names no locations at all. Each of the 4 Gospels' geographic information that we have internal to them is over 13 times, in fact, more complete than any other account that we have. So that's nothing to shake a stick at, you know? The writers also knew their relational stuff, and what I mean by that is they knew their people names. They seemed to be naming people accurately instead of creating characters, hence Mary, 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 and Mary, and Mary. Richard Bauckham is a New Testament scholar who has some really good tables for this. He looked at the primary sources, and he made sort of a baby name list. People like to think about that and like, what am I going to name my baby? And it's in the New York Times every year, most popular baby names. They tried to make a baby name list for the lifetime of Jesus, and he finds that the frequency with which different names in first century Palestine are given to people was fairly unique within the Middle East. So if the Gospels were written in Egypt, for example, where many of the forgeries are from, like I'd mentioned, we would expect a lot more congruence with Egyptian name frequencies than with Hebrew name frequencies, because people would be drawing on what they know, not what they don't know.
What time were these forgeries written? Maybe during the Alexandrian period, or afterwards, or what?
Generally, the ones that we're thinking about that might be reliable are from the pre-Alexandrian period. You mean like Alexander the Great, or what?
With their whole literary development in Egypt.
Oh, like Alexander or I'm trying to think of which. Can you anchor that in history for me?
No.
No. Okay. Because I was under the impression Alexander the Great was before the Roman Empire, right? Yep.
Oh, that's my bad.
Yeah. Yeah. But anyway, yeah, people could write, but they wouldn't know the frequencies of names that were in this area. So that's worth mentioning, though. So I thank you for that. Where was I? So we would expect here more congruence with Egyptian names than Hebrew names, but we see the opposite there. The Hebrew names are mentioned pretty well. Actually, we have some tables here. The proportions here, where they occur in all sources, is congruent or similar. What is it? Proportional, that's the word, to the number of times they're mentioned in the New Testament. This is Palestinian Jews' most popular names where they appear. And this is some pretty good accuracy for well within the margin of error for somebody who was from this area. It's very impressive, actually. In addition, the gospel writers seemed to know their cultural stuff. It is undisputed, even by the most skeptical of scholars, that the gospels were written within the Jewish culture.
I just want to point out on the names thing that
Let's go back to the
paper
names
has
thing.
been published. I believe the paper's been published pretty recently, like another one that makes, like a new study has been done that makes this even stronger of
Okay.
a case. And
Nice.
I'm not for sure about these numbers, but like the odds of like them randomly lining up, I think they've calculated to around 10 to the 20, like 1 in 10 to the 21st, somewhere-ish in that range. Don't exactly quote me on that, but.
Yeah, well, still, thanks for tacking a pretty good number on that. After this, I'm going to have to kind of get on with it.
It's just a sign of like in the Quran and in some of the hadith by Muhammad, like
Yeah.
he confuses Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Mary, the sister of Moses, because there's so many Marys in the Bible. So it's actually quite remarkable that the gospel writers were able to disentangle it, but someone in the 7th century who's just pseudepigraphical works in the Quran forgot the difference because he calls like the father of Mary, the sister of Moses, or like Mary, the mother of Jesus, Amram, and that's really the father of Moses, Moses' sister.
Okay, yeah.
Are you going to mention the disambiguators later, or?
Will you want to mention it right now? Because I think I skipped it.
So it's speaking about all these names being the same. The gospel writers even seem to implicitly know that because for the most common names, like Mary, they include.
For the most common names,
like Mary's mother.
they seem to disambiguate like which Mary this is and stuff like that.
So they know which names require clarification, and which names like are
They know which names require clarification and which are so uncommon that it would disambiguate them. They did this a lot with Jesus as well. Very good. And they did this a lot with Jesus as well. You can see as Jesus is being introduced, he's in large crowds. They say Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus who is called the Christ, Jesus who all these people are following. But then when it's obvious Jesus is on trial, they just say Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. So you have the same thing. Other aspects of culture that I will go through a little bit rapid fire. Let's see. We have a detailed knowledge of Jewish history and genealogy. There are several histories and acts about the Jewish worldview that are expressed very faithfully. We know about Jewish prophecies and eschatology from these writings. Jesus was an apocalyptic preacher. He said the time was fulfilled for prophecy to run its course. And the accounts of his life connect many obscure prophecies that are in the Old Testament to Jesus, especially Matthew. We have 55 examples of that. We have good knowledge of Jewish laws. Jesus is often seen Jesus is often seen debating Jewish regulations, purity standards, and the definition of marriage, and he seems to be sort of fulfilling this from what Moses taught them. But they seem to know what's going on there, as well as the theological disputes of the day about the resurrection between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, Jews versus the Samaritans. We have actually a coincidence that appeared with the Dead Sea Scrolls, where Jesus is talking with the devil. He appears to be being tempted, and the devil tells him, throw yourself off of this rock, because the psalm says that you won't strike your foot against the stone. We find in the Dead Sea Scrolls evidence that this psalm, Psalm 91, was actually used in this time to talk about exorcisms. So that's another important piece of data that says spiritual warfare linked with Psalm 91 makes perfect sense if you're writing within this context and not as much sense if you're writing outside of it. As you would expect, the forged Gospels include almost no references to Jewish daily life. Additionally, some more cultural familiarity. We know from the Gospels which plants were supposed to be tithed to the temple, the synagogue, and which trees grew in the area as well. With Zacchaeus, he climbed up in a sycamore tree, right? Sycamore trees did not grow outside of the Fertile Crescent. There you go. Finance as well. Stories about tax collectors are placed right where you would expect in regional capitals and transport hubs where the taxes would be going to Rome. Matthew, who tradition tells us was a tax collector himself, includes, what do you know, far more references to finance than the other Gospels. So it makes sense that, good evidence that who we thought was writing it was actually writing it, especially because Matthew is more in dispute than the other Gospels. They knew about local languages. In the triumphal entry where Jesus comes riding on a donkey and people cry, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, they say, Hosanna, not Hosiana, which is what it's written as in the Psalms. We have a change in pronunciation that happened within these 500 years that revelation from God appeared to be silent from Hosanna, from Hosiana. This is a repetition of a pronunciation shift that is repeated in the Gospels exactly as you would expect it to be. Finally, we have unusual customs that are pretty faithfully recorded. For example, the writers knew that the Jewish feast of Passover was expected to be celebrated in Jerusalem, and people were expected to sing some psalms after the meal. And so we have Jesus and his disciples singing a hymn before they go to have all of the things that happen with the cross and stuff to Jesus. And as expected, this degree of knowledge of customs is far better than the false Gospels, and it suggests that they were written by people who knew what who knew about the Jewish customs before they were suppressed in AD 70 and Jews were forbidden from practicing the things that made them Jewish after the Jewish war and when the temple was destroyed, as Jesus predicted. So chalk up another one not only for biographical authorship, but for early authorship. We know people who we know that these are written at least by people who knew what was going on before it became impossible to know what was going on. And finally, I'll finish out this sort of penultimate section, because we're getting close to time, with the more recently thought about, yet also most powerful defenses for eyewitness testimony called undesigned coincidences. Tim McGrew has been with us before. Somebody's mentioned him, and his wife Lydia has sort of brought this back into the limelight in academia and the discussion. Think back to the crime scene witness analogy, if you would. Sometimes one witness will leave the detective with a question, why did he say it that way? And this sort of becomes a thing in the back of the detective's mind until the testimony of another witness corroborates this and makes the sort of in passing mention from witness A make a lot more sense and make both of them appear more credible and less likely that they've colluded. We have the same thing happening in the gospel accounts. They back each other up and they fill details in a way that the writers could not have done if they were writing as mythologists, and whatever, if they weren't writing as biographers. And they would not have done that if they were intending to collude to filter the story, saying, hey, let's all write the same story so that we can all die for the same lie instead of dying for a bunch of different lies. We can all get brutally murdered for the same thing all at the same time as buddies. Clearly, that's not what they were doing. Few examples. In Luke and John, we have two different narratives about Mary and Martha. The events are so different that the apostles couldn't have made up how the people acted in these two events basing themselves on the other person's thoughts of them. In Luke, they're having dinner together, and in John, their brother is being raised from the dead, so they're a little bit different from each other. In both cases, though, we have Mary and Martha characterized in exactly the same way. Martha is the one who is busy working on being a hostess, while Mary is the one who is learning from Jesus, sitting at his feet, and just being attentive to him. And Martha is annoyed a little bit about this in both accounts. So these are two different settings, two different contexts for the same thing happening. This is an undesigned coincidence. The simplest explanation to which is that we're talking about real characters rather than fabricated ones. Number two, two of Jesus' disciples are brothers, James and John, who are now famous for being the examples in every math problem you've ever done. In Mark, Jesus calls this dynamic duo the Boanerges, or sons of thunder is what that means. But he provides no reason why, and so we would be left wondering that, if not for Luke 9, where Jesus and his followers are not invited to stay in a Samaritan town as they're going towards Jerusalem, so they're kicked out. Now, in this context, being refused hospitality is probably the greatest insult you can receive. So this is a culture that focuses very much on honor and shame and hospitality and welcome. So James and John, naturally, as you would expect, ask Jesus if he wants them to send fire from heaven and destroy this city. The answer is no, by the way. Christianity is ideally not a violent religion. So we have here, they're called sons of thunder. In Luke chapter 9, we now have a reason why they might be called this that we wouldn't know otherwise, undesigned. When Jesus is being mocked third before his crucifixion, Matthew says that somebody hits him across the face and they say, prophesy, who hit you? The question is confusing because Jesus could have just looked at whoever hit him. But Luke in chapter 22, verse 64, he unintentionally clarifies this part from Matthew by saying that Jesus was blindfolded. So once again, separate details from separate people that confirm the biographical nature of the other one. The last example is sort of a trinity. It's 3 in 1. In Mark 6, we have the account of Jesus feeding 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Mark tells us that there are many people coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. So they're pretty busy. But he doesn't explain why this area that they're in is so much like I-635 on any normal day. But John does. He says this event took place near the Passover, at which time the road to Jerusalem, the roads in the Holy Land, would indeed be as bad as 635 on any day. Although hopefully without somebody running over people and stabbing them like we had a couple weeks ago. That was not fun. Anyway, in the same event, Jesus asks his follower Philip a rhetorical question: where should we go to buy 5,000 people's worth of bread? Now, Philip is sort of an obscure disciple. He's hardly ever singled out like this. He's sort of the shy guy. And John doesn't explain why he's singled out now. But Luke, however, includes this tidbit that this miracle took place near Bethsaida, which happens to be Philip's hometown. So it's natural that Jesus would ask somebody with local knowledge. This is once again an undesigned coincidence, B clarifying A, and making both more believable. Finally, Jesus has the disciples sit the people down on what Mark calls green grass. Now, yes, they touched grass. By the way, if anybody wants to get a certificate that says they touched grass, I think they're still giving that out in Comments Against Computer Programming. This is a real thing, by the way. Yep. So why would Mark include this detail? It doesn't make sense, but it makes much more sense when you square it with John, who said that it's Passover time. And when you look at the external research, you see that Passover in this decade, around AD 30 or AD 33, would have fallen right after the rainiest 5 months of the year, hence green grass. Once again, what we have here and in all of these are episodes where with so many seemingly unnecessary details that are ripe for contradiction, ripe for muddling up if we're writing a myth. But instead, all we get is coincidences explaining each detail while simultaneously ruling out collusion. And you can see why I like this argument from undesigned coincidence so much. So that's it, as we're close to being out of time. That's the modest evidence for a modest claim, coming within the texts, across the texts, beyond the texts, and against the obviously false texts. Hopefully, not trying to be a single thing to knock down the house, but hopefully chipping away the plausibility of these accounts being written as myths, far removed from what they're writing about. With each little bit of evidence that we have here pointing towards a cumulative case, I hope it's sufficient to encourage you to read these texts for what they are, biographies. And with that brick, we can go on to build a more coherent house in favor of an evidence for this thing that we all seem to be practicing together. I want to take a few minutes, if I can, to talk about objections. This is my building a cumulative case GIF. But anyway, objections. This is also my Episcopalian bashing session because I have worked for the Episcopal Church, and this denomination sometimes has some weird stuff in it theologically. Bart Ehrman, in his book Misquoting Jesus, he says that they might have actually started as history. Ehrman himself argued against the mythicist view that Jesus never actually existed in a 2012 book, but he says they might have been embellished over time. There's evidence of this happening in the ending of the Gospel of Mark, where we have some outlandish claims that scholars now reject as being actually part of the initial Gospel of Mark. And this will be dealt with much more in detail by Ryan Cruz October 1st. But somebody like Bart Ehrman does have the burden of proof to say when this would have taken place. Someone who would say this risks making unsubstantiated claims about a window of history that continues to shrink more and more as we discover more and more new manuscripts. So if the claim that that the biographies were changed from being biographies to myths was based on a period from which we do have manuscripts or which we get manuscripts in the future, this becomes a non-starter. It's essentially trying to say the printed New York Times was changed from a news report to a fantastical account 5 hours after it was printed, and it's all over the city, all over the country, and somebody has to gather up all of these, change a little letter, or change all of the text, and then redistribute them exactly as it was. It's impossible, and that's why this objection ends up being a non-starter if you or at least a very high burden of proof. Number 2 comes from the Right Reverend John Shelby Spong, Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Newark, or Bishop deceased of him. And this is the kind of person who says that dogmas and creeds are a stage in our development and they're part of our religious childhood. So what he claims overall is that there was something that actually happened within on this Sunday when Christians believe Jesus rose again. But it wasn't a physical resurrection because that would make God some sort of miracle worker. He actually says this. He actually says this, and we watched it in one of our debate nights, and we watched it over like 3 times laughing at it. You're a bishop. Anyway. Yes, and that's why we're going to do it again. Anyway, and he bases this sort of on the contradictions in the resurrection accounts. But once again, as we've said, the contradictions in the resurrection accounts make the cumulative case far more coherent, not less coherent. And so Spong faces this gigantic burden of proof to actually say, first of all, what he's talking about, which he seemed to be adamantly refusing to do, and then also provide some evidence that that's what's actually happening. So, and he has to go against everything that we've talked about today already. It's disappointing. And finally, we'll go back to Jordan Peterson. There's a video that I was going to play, but I managed my time really badly. Basically what he says, he's talking with atheist YouTuber Alex O'Connor, who's a friend of Justin Brierley's, actually. And basically what he says, O'Connor gets him into this really good corner of a question where he says, if I brought my Panasonic tape recorder to the Sunday morning outside of the tomb, what would I see on the little LCD display? Would I see somebody walking out? Jordan Peterson says probably yes, which is very interesting. But then he says, but I can't tell you anything beyond that because I have no idea what it means. Peterson is this kind of person who is a philosopher, and he will say, what does this mean? We had a discussion about this in our Discord, joking about it. And I want to talk about this because this way of thinking seems to hold increasing sway in postmodern thought about religion, where it can mean something, but I don't really know what it means in the insulin kind of way, so I'm going to mean it in the ice cream kind of way and turn something out of it for myself. And I have yet to see apologists finding an effective way to get beyond it. William Lane Craig gets really far beyond Spong, but I haven't seen too much getting beyond the I believe this happened, but I don't know what to do with it sort of way. Well, the eyewitnesses to the post-resurrection appearances seemed to know what it meant. And I think that we can also know what it meant as a result of this if my thesis is actually well defended, that there is somebody who actually claimed to be a king over everything, claims to be judge over everything, to whom we will all be subject in a future resurrection. Now this is, goes beyond the scope of what we're talking about, but I think it will come much closer to within the scope of what we're going to be talking about as a club through this semester, through the next semester, as we continue to build this house together. I hope you'll join us for this building of the house as we continue to do it. So we've laid down a few bricks, and we'll keep building. Thank you. Okay, we're going to Brahms after this. And does anybody have any final questions that we can talk about?
Yeah, I got 2 questions. One
Sure.
is, I heard the gospel writers were inspired by the Holy Spirit to write down accurate depictions.
Christians would believe that, yeah.
So why are there minor contradictions and differences?
Like I've said, the contradictions themselves don't necessarily exclude each other, and it makes that claim much more clear. It makes the general claim about the accuracy of the resurrection much more clear. I'm going to continue to say that, but I think that when we talk about inspiration by the Holy Spirit, well, actually, Byron, if you want to answer that, go ahead. Yeah.
I think that when you're, one would have to define what we actually mean
Yeah.
by contradiction, right? And oftentimes when people will look at the gospel accounts and say there are contradictions, what they actually mean is that there's different tellings of the same event. So, for example, it was brought up, that there's differing, there's a variety of how many guards were at the tomb, how many angels were at the tomb, who went to the tomb, how many women went to the tomb, and these differences don't constitute contradiction.
Yeah, but if you were inspired by the Holy Spirit, then theoretically it would give you the accurate information about how many died, and you could write down the actual number.
So the nature of, okay, so the idea of, or the nature of inspiration, okay, this can be a really big, that can be a really big discussion. In terms of inspiration and accuracy, there was no a different variation of a story is not an inaccuracy.
Yeah.
It is a
way that one individual accounted for what they saw, right? The Spirit, when it came upon them, it says, I will lead you into all truth, right? The Spirit will bring remembrance, right? But there was very much a human element in their opinion, right? Because we don't believe in divine dictation,
Yeah.
right? Where God says, okay, now write down A, right? But he brought to remembrance what happened during their time, and they accounted for that. I mean, Luke, we saw Luke chapter 1, right? He takes being inspired, and we can go into what that means, but being inspired, Luke gathers sources to himself to give an accurate account, right? So this doesn't divert from the inspiration of the Spirit, but this is human agency doing the
Maybe an
collecting.
example would help. So one of the Gospels says there was one angel there that spoke something. Maybe they were emphasizing just, I saw, they wanted to talk about the fact that there was a spokesperson angel. The other one focused on, there was two total angels. But the one that said there was an angel who spoke didn't say there was one and only one angel.
Right.
So it's not a contradiction. And then there's
Yeah.
an example where one of the Gospels says Mary went to the tomb, but it only lists her. But she says in a quotation, she says a plural form to imply there were others with her.
Yeah.
It just, the names weren't enumerated. It might be like if you're talking to a friend about what you did a couple nights ago when you were with a big group, you might mention a couple people that were there because they know them, but that's not to imply that there was no one else there.
Yeah.
But you
And-
might tell the same thing to someone else and those different people that they knew.
So
Sure.
the Holy Spirit didn't like put words in their mouth to write. It's just like
It wasn't a dictation model, but I think really no Christians really believe in a dictation model.
Yeah. And that explains really well what I would also say about it, which is, if we believe that the Holy Spirit gave the apostles, the evangelists, remembrance of the events that took place, and actually in a way that is really good given how consistent internally they are and consistent externally they are, especially for events that were a couple of decades ago, they recount them very accurately by that standard. If the Holy Spirit brings to them the remembrance of those events, it's still completely within their liberty to express those events the best way that they can do. And that's why we have things like Matthew talking a lot more about finance, because he was a tax collector. He had a finance degree, basically. He went to JSOM. And and that's why Luke talks about health details a lot in a lot more detail, because they remember the same events, but they expressed them in ways that makes a lot more sense given who they were. So you actually end up with a lot more consistency and pretty good warrant for the idea of inspiration.
And you also have to think about we're talking about oral culture. Okay, we're talking about people that can tell you a story or read the Old Testament to you, and people go back and they remember what was said. Right? So you have memories, ways of remembering, or the ability to remember things that far surpass what we do now, because it was an oral culture. It wasn't strictly a written culture.
And because writing was hard, brevity was very important. Yeah, it was very expensive.
Yeah.
You'd have to copy it. So there was a big incentive to be really brief and not share all the little details. Like if you're writing something today into a word processor that you can distribute, I mean, there's no reason to be brief about it, like it would be if you're writing on a scroll.
And second question is, you said Luke was like a follower or disciple of Paul.
Yes.
So that means he wasn't an eyewitness. So why do we trust his gospel?
Because I'll refer you back to that beginning where he says, I have followed all things closely from the beginning. J. Warner Wallace mentions this additional detail where he says, it seemed good to me to write an orderly account to you, most excellent Theophilus. Why did he include that word orderly? J. Warner Wallace seems to think that it's because he was aware of the existence of the Gospel of Mark that seemed to have some events out of order. That doesn't mean that the events didn't take place. It just means that they're slightly out of order with what Luke seemed to be under the impression of. So we have knowledge of that, and we say, Luke is trying to improve on information that's already available. He's going to incorporate some stuff that Mark knows. But also he's going to talk to the people who saw those things and get the most accurate picture that he can get. And we have some pretty good evidence within Luke and his sequel, basically the Acts of the Apostles, that he did just that. And also when you think about it, Luke distributes his gospel. It's covered in errors, let's say that. It's covered in falsehoods. The people who read it, who were eyewitnesses themselves, would pick it up and they would say, well, that's definitely wrong. We need to make some changes. We don't have any evidence of that happening. We have a lot more unified acceptance of those works by people who could have rejected them because they were eyewitnesses to a greater degree than Luke was. So it passes pretty well.
He went and interviewed all the eyewitnesses.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Those are all great questions.
Absolutely.
Good stuff.
Yeah. And bring more of those questions, everybody, to Frank Turek's talk next Thursday in the SSA Auditorium, because that is going to be a really good one. I'm